Hokahe. Well, welcome to the afternoon session. We have a very dynamic speaker coming from the Shawnee Lenape Nation, founder and co-director of the Indigenous Law Institute. Some of you may have purchased his latest publication called Pagans in the Promised Land. So I'd like to introduce Steve Newcomb.
Thank you. Ishelamiang, mir ongundawakan, mili ongundawakan, wuli nipalinan, wanishi kishelamiang. It's just a short prayer in our Lenape language. And I want to thank the organizers of this event and Haskell University for hosting it, Dan Wildcat, and forgot to turn off my phone. Apologize. But in any case, I think it's strange in a way that I'm here. Yesterday was my birthday, and it was really interesting that I was coming here because my great-grandfather, Solomon Newcomb, and my grandpa, Bushyhead Spybuck Newcomb, both attended Haskell back in the boarding school days, and that's really, there's a lot of interesting family history there, obviously, good and bad. When my grandpa ran away from Haskell at the age of 15, they put AWOL on his packet, on his file, and because it was a military academy. And of course it was designed to, the schools in those days were designed off of that model started by Colonel Pratt to kill the Indian, save the man, right? To destroy our languages, cultures, and spiritual traditions. But I'm happy to say that it didn't succeed as far as the Christian part of the acculturation process. My grandma told me that my grandpa used to love, he was a man that loved to hunt and fish, and he would love to be way out in nature. They eventually moved to the Pacific Northwest, where I was born. And she said when he was out there, as far out as he could be and all alone, that's when he was in his church. That's what he said. And so that you can really never take that spirituality out of our people, I hope. But I'm not really here to talk about all that. I'm here to talk about the theme of this conference, which is the rights of Mother Earth, as it's referred to. And I have my own ideas about that. And I will also talk about the doctrines of discovery and domination. And I want to start out by acknowledging my friend and mentor, spiritual leader of the Oglala. Well, he's not the leader, but he's a important spiritual figure of the Oglala Lakota Nation, Virgil Kilstraight. He was one of the principal organizers of the Chief Bigfoot Memorial Ride in honor of the ancestors of the Oglala people, others that were the Hunkpapa and so forth that were massacred at Wounded Knee. So I wanted to acknowledge him. And all the other spiritual people that have been influential in my life. I've been very fortunate from the age of 16 to have been able to spend a lot of time with elders and spiritual people, and that's been most important to me and has been influential in the way that I have been able to understand the historical record. I guess I also should acknowledge Vine Deloria Jr., because if it hadn't been for his book, God is Red, I would not have known about the Papal Bull of 1493, which he wrote about in that book, which called for the subjugation of barbarous nations. Then when I studied federal Indian law under Charles Wilkinson at the University of Oregon, I took a semester of federal Indian law from him at the University of Oregon School of Law. And we read Johnson versus McIntosh, a case from 1823. And, pardon me, in that case, I noticed that it said that it talked about the charters of England and the idea that the Christian people had discovered lands of natives who were heathens, and Christian people those two words were italicized by the Supreme Court. And then in my mind, I immediately linked that to what I had read in Vine Deloria Jr. So that got me very curious about that connection. And eventually I decided against the idea of going to law school, because I thought if that's the foundation of that particular system, it would make little sense for me to pursue that. If that's their premise, it's also going to be their conclusion. But the thing I want to emphasize is that it's important, as far as my way of thinking, to not start with the European history, but as Dr. Robert Yazzie mentioned, and others have mentioned here today, to go back to the oral history and the oral traditions and have that understanding that goes all the way back to the beginning of time and the creation stories, because that's really where we originate within the spirit world, and then our connection to go through those various phases where we get to this point in our lives as two-leggeds, and all that entails, and those original instructions, those original laws given to us, which are the original laws of this land, wherever you go, throughout this whole continent, throughout the whole hemisphere, those original laws were put in place. And the Creator gave those to us as guidelines, as ways of understanding how to sustain and perpetuate life. And so with those understandings, life is able to become healthy, and there's a sense of well-being and an understanding of the purpose, the right relationship with the earth and all creation through those understandings, those concepts which are alive, as Robert Yazzie pointed out, through the knowledge of their elders and their wisdom that they've carried. So if we understand time in a different conception, that it goes back to those originating events and the elements and the origins of creation, then you see all the accumulated knowledge and wisdom that has occurred. So when the colonizers arrived with their idea that they had a right to discover and conquer, or to discover and dominate all non-Christian lands that they came upon, and I'll get a little bit more into that in a moment, but when they arrived and they set up everything, all the patterns of destruction that they put into place and all the patterns of desecration and so forth, they deprive themselves. See, it's impossible to dehumanize others without dehumanizing yourself. And so it's impossible to destroy those traditions without also preventing themselves from learning from those wisdom traditions. And so that's where we are. We're at this crossroads that finally it's getting to the point where it's so bad that everything has become so insane, basically, that now people are going to begin to wake up and say, maybe those people really had something going on after all. And then hopefully there will be a receptivity that hasn't been existing there previously. But to back up a bit, to go further into the doctrines of domination and the conceptual system of domination, it's important to understand those documents that were issued by the Holy See, which the word see, S-E-E, means seat. So it's the Holy Seat of the Pope, which goes back to the tradition of the Roman Empire. And in the 15th century, and even earlier, the popes were issuing various documents called Papal Bulls, and they were called bulls because of a little lead ball that was hung by a red silken thread, which is attached to wax, and the Pope put his imprint of his ring on that wax, and that showed that it was an official document. And in those documents we can read the language. There's a book called European Treaties, bearing on the history of the United States and its dependencies to 1648. And all you have to do is go to Google Books and type in European Treaties bearing on, and hit enter, and there it is, in Latin and English. So I recommend it. And what I've done since 1989 or 90, when I was able to obtain copies of those documents through the kind help of a librarian at the Catholic University in Washington, D.C., called them and asked them where to find it, and they told me. So I've been able to look at the Latin and the English, and what I found is that there's a specific vocabulary in those documents and in many other documents, such as the Charters of England, and all of the words actually are synonyms for the exact same thing. And that exact same thing is domination. And so I've developed a concept recently which contrasts with the idea of the spiritual and cultural protocols of our nations and peoples, and it's called the Protocol of Domination. And what kind of words are we talking about? Well, for example, in one of the Papal Bulls from 1493, there's a sentence, and it says, sub dominio actuali temporali alicorum dominorum Christianorum constitute non sint. And what that means is not under the domination of any Christian dominator. And that word dominorum and the word dominium, they go back to a root in Latin called domo. And that root has 7 meanings, basically, probably more, but 7 primary meanings, which is interesting because of the 7 laws that I was taught through Virgil Kilstraight. So it kind of is an exact contrast to that. But those 7 laws of domo, as we might call them, laws, which are patterns of thought, paths of behavior, are subjugate, subdue, subservience, tame, domesticate, domestic dependent nations, cultivate, and to till. Cultivate in Latin is colere, which means to colonize and to design. The root of colere, or really of colon, the root of colonization is colon, which is the digestive tract of the body politic, to extend that metaphor. But colo, in Latin, C-O-L-O, is to filter out impurities in the process of mining. So the background context is the mining, and that means mining everything for profit, for wealth, and so forth, power. And so the root impetus to the entire thing is greed, the will to domination, the will to be enriched in order to gain more power. So it's the cycle. But domination has specific effects, and we'll go into some of those in just a moment. But first, I want to talk about the difference in terms of a physical understanding of truth, or quote-unquote reality, and a metaphorical understanding of reality. There are so many ways in which metaphorical understandings of truth or reality get treated as if they are physically true. For example, if someone is standing near a tree, I could say to a person, I could say, that man or that woman standing in front of the tree. But does a tree have a front or a back without us projecting our own bodily front or back onto that tree? No. Those are our conceptions. Those are human conceptions projected onto others or to other things. Even thinking of things as various processes as things. Many of these complicated metaphorical conceptions just need to have more detail placed onto them. For example, if we talk about the foundation, the analogy there is the foundation of a house or a building, some kind of a physical foundation. But if we're talking about the foundation of a system, we're not talking about something that's physical. We're talking about something that's conceptual. It's concepts put together into patterns, which lead to behavior. And so we're talking about examining those conceptual foundations of various systems and what do they reveal. And so when we delve deep into the way in which these conceptions of domination all fit together, and we come up with a list, and I probably won't read the whole list, but it's pretty interesting because you can take this list of the Protocol of Domination and realize that when you read certain documents, especially with regard to indigenous history or Indian history, you're going to find these throughout all kinds of documents. So, and these are from the Papal Bulls. For example, the Papal Bull of 1452, issued by Pope Nicholas V to King Alfonso of Portugal, instructs the king I have to speak a bit slower for the translator, I apologize. But it actually instructs or authorizes the king to, quote, invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to take away all their possessions and property, and to convert their possessions and properties. Now, because convert in that context means to unlawfully or wrongfully take or appropriate that which belongs to another, then the Pope in the next sentence says he declares it to be just and lawful, because he has to account for them doing stuff that's unlawful. But conceptually, metaphorically, they can just say voila, and it's lawful. So here's the list: invade, capture, vanquish, conquer, conqueror, conquest, subdue, subjugate, subordinate, subject, subjected, subjection, reduce, reduction, rule, sway, diminish, colonize, colonizing, colonization, civilization, civilizing, which means dominating, mission, domestic, dependency, dependent, crown, empire, imperial, dominion, dominium, dominus, dominus, deprimantur, which means to push down, press down, weigh down, hold down, dominorum, sovereignty, government with a capital G. The word government, governments appears in the Papal Bull of 1493. There's a sentence that says, "We trust in him," capital H on him. So we know who that's talking about, or we think we do, but there's no name, it's just a him, so maybe we don't. From whom empires and dominations, dominationes in Latin, and all good things proceed. So think about that for a moment. I asked the Vatican ambassador, the new Vatican ambassador from the Holy See to the United Nations, I asked him last year, what does Dominorum Christianorum mean? I didn't know he was the ambassador, by the way, but I had the opportunity, so I asked. And he said, well, it probably means lords, probably master, probably mister, yes, mister. And I said, so in other words, lands not possessed by any Mr. Christian? And he said, it's best not to translate it into English because it would not fit. But then I had the ironic opportunity the next day, or maybe it wasn't even that evening, to ask a Latin scholar the very same question, and without pausing for 1 second, he said Christian dominator. But in that Papal Bull from 1493, it says, we trust in him, as I said, from whom empires, dominations, all good things proceed. But the English version doesn't say dominations, it says governments. So the dominationes and governments are synonyms, okay, translated from Latin to English. So that's how we know that singular domination is also government, and they're parallel there. Now there is another set of words that are used for dehumanizing and dominating purposes, and you'll recognize, I'm sure, all of these: wild, barbarous, savage, heathen, pagan, infidel, wandering, and after that I put around free of domination, roaming free of domination, which is the word roaming. You'll see that constantly in the legal literature, in the Supreme Court cases. These are wandering, roaming people, so therefore they have a certain kind of title that goes with wandering, roaming people that are temporarily on the soil. That is, until they can take it away. Minors, tribes, tribal, aborigines, aboriginal, ethnic groups, rude, primitive, ignorant, dirty, and so forth. Now, aborigine is very interesting because aboriginal is the adjective form of aborigine. So then you have to go to that word and look it up. And it means, according to the dictionary, a native of a particular place as distinguished from a invading, colonizing society. So an Aboriginal title, then, is a title as distinguished from an invading, colonizing society. And what is the title, metaphorically speaking? that was created by the United States government with regard to indigenous nations and peoples or Indian nations. It's called occupancy, the Aboriginal title or original title. Now what is Aboriginal title? Is it the actual spiritual cultural relationship with the land for thousands and thousands of years going back to the beginning of time, such as what Robert Yazzie mentioned and Mona mentioned? No. It's a non-Indian concept, metaphorically created and projected onto our lands, our territories, and then they tell us, oh, by the way, your Aboriginal title has been extinguished. Well, what have they succeeded in extinguishing? Simply their non-Indian idea about your relationship to your land, not your actual cultural, spiritual relationship with your land. But why don't we point that out to them? And so we need to be coming up with alternative ways of framing and thinking about all of these important issues. And I am coming to the theme of the rights of Mother Earth in a little bit. There's a book published in 1949 called The Sociology of Colonies by René Monnier. And it's an amazing book. It's actually 2 volumes. And there's an entire chapter on domination. And it's just astounding, these two books. Let's see, there's so much. I could go ahead and read you a couple lines here. Let's see. From the authoritarian standpoint, it would seem that the imperialist doctrine is professed by the Anglo-Saxons as a judicial system. It is claimed that the chosen peoples, in quotes, have the right and the duty of dominating, but certain other peoples are necessarily the subjects of the chosen peoples, that imperial races are bound in duty to exercise their superiority. In this spirit, an apology for slavery was even recently formulated. This is written in 1949. And then further down, he talks about how the conception of the state, according to the Anglo-Saxon doctrine, is therefore active and expansive. The function of the state is the domination of inferior or backward peoples. The aim of the collective organism, which we call empire, is to ensure this domination by the people designed by God over the peoples destined to submit to its power. So if we were to do a rhetorical analysis of this and look for our vocabulary from the Protocols of Domination, we would obviously find that throughout. And there's another important book called Imperialism, Sovereignty, and the Making of International Law by Professor Anthony Angie, who has an SJD from Harvard and who now teaches at a law school in Utah. In the preface to that book, he actually, James Crawford, another professor of international law, talks about the way in which the structure of domination and subordination has operated in international law, and that's what he says Professor Angie has very well documented, very capably documented. Interestingly enough, Professor Angie, at a certain point, refers to the Protocol of Conquest, which is exactly the same as the Protocol of Domination, just using a different word, obviously conquest and domination being synonyms. And he said that in reference to a book by a professor named Patricia Seed, talking about ceremonies of possession in Europe's conquest of the New World. There's a book from 1938, which is actually called Creation of Rights of Sovereignty Through Symbolic Acts. Creation of Rights of Sovereignty through symbolic acts. The idea there is that they could come to a distant shore of non-Christian lands, wave a sword, pile up some stones, sprinkle some water, throw some soil, tear up some grass, break some branch, any of these various rituals and claim on that basis, and it didn't have to be all of them, it could be any, and based on those ideas of ritual acts, metaphorical acts, to say that they had created sovereignty because there was no sovereignty existing there, despite the presence of indigenous nations and peoples already being there, but that they had created sovereignties just by virtue of doing that. We have the opportunity in our generation to say nonsense, to delve deep into the historical record of what has taken place. Now, coming to the theme of to the rights of Mother Earth, it's my view that just as human rights, a discussion of human rights is a result of dehumanization and an effort to overcome the effects and patterns of dehumanization, that in the same way, speaking of Mother Earth as having rights is a result of what I call domination law and the patterns of domination, the systems that have been put in place on that basis. If we leave the context of domination law untouched, if we don't discuss that and identify domination as having deadly, lethal effects on peoples, on waters, on lands, on all the different vocabulary we might come up with, then we haven't done much. And because we, as indigenous nations and peoples, are to be the ones that have the responsibility to speak for the plants and the animals and what's called nature, to speak for Mother Earth, because we were given that spiritual and cultural responsibility. So I would just provide that reference point and everything that I've spoken to. I was surprised that, did a half hour go by that quick? Or I don't think we started on time. I looked at my clock and I'm like, my goodness. Huh? Oh, I have 8 minutes. Oh my goodness. I was wrapping up. So it's interesting to look at the Supreme Court rulings that have been written on the basis of what I call the Protocol of Domination, and to look at the way in which, for example, in the 1823 decision, Johnson versus McIntosh, the Supreme Court said their rights, meaning the Indians' rights to complete sovereignty as independent nations, were diminished by the original fundamental principle that discovery gave title to those who made it, meaning made the discovery. And what did he base that on? He based it on charters of England, which said things like seek out, discover, and find whatsoever isles, countries, regions of the heathen and infidel, which before this time have been unknown to all Christian people. See, there's a tendency among federal Indian law scholars to do something that's very damaging to the telling of history. They'll tell you that the doctrine of discovery is actually the idea that the first Europeans to discover non-European lands, that those Europeans have a right to those lands and so forth, okay? But the actual documents, when you go back to them, you can't find the word European in there at all. You're not going to find the word European in any of those Papal Bulls. That was a different time. It was a medieval world of Christendom. And at that time, you had something called the International Law of Christendom, as revealed by Henry Winton in his International Law textbook written in 1836. So the idea that it was Europeans discovering non-European lands is actually a rewriting of history. It's inaccurate, and it's preventing people from understanding that there's a religious dimension to this entire process of domination and destruction that's been going on for more than 5 centuries. In 1954, there was a case that went before the Supreme Court called Tehitan Indians versus United States. And it had to do with whether or not the Tehitan Indians up in Alaska were deserving of monetary compensation for a federal taking of timberlands, quite a large area of timberlands. And so the U.S. government had to submit a legal brief to the U.S. Supreme Court. And I didn't know about this legal brief until after I wrote my book. after it came out. And my friend Peter Dorico, who's just an amazing friend of mine, we've known each other for more, I guess, 20 years now, and he and I have worked real well together. He's a professor emeritus from UMass Amherst. And so he and I were talking one day about an unusual case that had all kinds of information about Papal Bulls in it, a case called Cornet versus Winton from the Supreme Court of Tennessee. And he said, well, let me do a search to see how many times Cornet versus Winton has ever been cited. So he went ahead and did that search, and what came up was the Tihitan decision. So I've read that before, but he sent me the link. Well, what's interesting about the internet now, when you go to the link, you not only receive the actual ruling, but you receive the briefs that were filed. And so here was the actual U.S. legal brief filed in that case. And I open it up, start reading it, and I'm shocked because it actually cites a papal bull referring to the Canary Islands, with reference to the Canary Islands, issued in 1344. I think it was actually 1346, but they said 1344. But it referred to the charters of England. It referred to the Johnson versus McIntosh decision. It actually referenced Genesis 1:28 and part of Psalms. And it distinguished, and by the way, this is in the section of the ruling under the big heading argument. So that means everything that falls under it is the main argument of the United States government. So underneath this, it talks about the Christian nations of Europe discovering the lands of heathens and infidels. This is the government, United States government, writing this, all right? And they argued it before the Supreme Court. Now, I wish that we had audio of that, because there are audio tapes available of arguments before the Supreme Court, but unfortunately they didn't start the audio until the following year after Tihitan. But we do have the actual legal brief. So I wrote a column on this. I do write columns for Indian Country Today Media Network, and I wrote a column on it called The Smoking Gun, and showing that, yeah, I mean, if the United States government is making the argument, or has made the argument explicitly, and you cannot find any reference to that type of language in the actual ruling, except the one little clue where the majority decision written by Justice Stanley Reed from Kentucky, I think he was. But in any case, they reference Wheaton's Elements of International Law. And Wheaton's Elements of International Law in the chapter on property, chapter 4, actually lays out the exact same pattern. It italicized the word Christian, just like Marshall did. Marshall, on behalf of the entire Supreme Court, italicized Christian people in Johnson v. McIntosh. It's all right there. But I'm still waiting for any practitioner or scholar of federal Indian law to actually acknowledge that the United States government made that argument in 1954, and that it was upheld by the Supreme Court in 1955, the following year I was born, actually. So just to come to a conclusion here, I think that it's excellent that people are talking about these issues. I think they need to be discussed far and wide. I would like to see a trend happen where we begin to see the non-Indian society acknowledge the traditional territories, where, for example, I'm working with a person from the Unitarian Universalist Church, and he's preparing a statement for his congregation's church to acknowledge the traditional territory of the people where their church is located, and to pay honor and respect to the people of that territory. For example, when people ask me, where do you live? I say I live in the Kumeyaay territory, now commonly called San Diego. And it still is the traditional territory of the Kumeyaay. And so when we were up at Niagara Falls for the North American Indigenous Peoples Caucus meeting in preparation for the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, where, by the way, the theme for the entire permanent forum will be the doctrine of Christian discovery and domination, the North American Indigenous Peoples Caucus report stated very clearly that that's on Haudenosaunee territory. And so to the extent that we're able to do that and create that shift, then people can begin to also learn, well, what are the laws? What are the original laws of the people of this territory that run with the land? The fundamental, the foundational laws and concepts that go with that can lead to a shift in consciousness and shift in behavior. So these are just some of the things that one little idea is a suggestion that maybe is significant. I will say I want to acknowledge the World Council of Churches and also the Episcopal Church, where they have actually passed resolutions condemning and renouncing the doctrine of Christian discovery and dominion or domination. And I will say lastly that we started a campaign. Virgil and I started a campaign along with several others, and that was picked up by Chief Warren Lyons and the Traditional Circle of Elders, and the 13 grandmothers actually picked it up as well, to go ahead and call upon the Pope and the Holy See and so forth to formally revoke the Papal Bull of 1493 as a way of helping people to become educated about these issues. And so now it is on the world stage through the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and we want to keep the issue alive and well and create that transformational shift that will actually be beneficial to Mother Earth and all living things. And it's happening, but we're in dire straits. The radiation from Fukushima is not going to stop. It's going to keep moving toward North America, and I feel my heart goes out to the people of Japan who are suffering from that, and to the peoples that are suffering everywhere from effects of domination, whether it's the tar sands or the people to the south. Everywhere in the world, people are being impacted, but it's not just indigenous peoples, it's everyone on the planet at this point. At a time when the U.S. government has now said it's lawful for them to assassinate U.S. citizens and to round up and detain anyone, anytime, anywhere on the planet under the National Defense Authorization Act, and also at a time like that, we're in dire straits, and it's a crazy time we live in. But we have to stay spiritually centered. We have to stay grounded ceremonially, and go forward with no fear and with no hesitation. So thank you very much.